Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy Center, by the Center for Jewish Studies, and by the Program on Constitutional Government in the Government Department. This is the final session of a conference which began yesterday on what has neoconservatism wrought. But our subject tonight is, can magazines influence America? And we have an array of magazine editors who have attempted to influence America, even in our audience, as a matter of fact. There is a kind of richness of magazine editors. Father Richard Newhouse was the editor of First Things, and Joseph Epstein, the editor of American Scholar, and Roger Kimball and Hilton Kramer, editors of The New Criterion.
Nathan Glazer.
And Nathan Glazer, who's a co-editor of Public Interest. And moreover, we tried to get, I've forgotten that man who went to Yale, people from the National Review. But the ones we've actually got for you are...
Buckley isn't here, is he?
No, I didn't. For some reason, no. He isn't here, but...
Not the editor anymore, anyway.
But the five editors that we do have here, I would like to introduce to you very rapidly in the order in which they will speak. First, Martin Peretz, who is editor-in-chief of The New Republic, which he's been since 1974. Second, William Phillips, who's editor-in-chief of Partisan Review, which he's been since the founding of the magazine in the late 30s. And then Irving Kristol, who was co-editor of Public Interest since 1965. And then on my left, Michael Walzer, who was co-editor of Dissent, which he's been since the 1970s, though his association with the magazine began earlier than that. And last, Norman Podhoretz, who is the editor of Commentary magazine, now 35 years, since 1960. So we'll begin first with Martin Peretz.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I should confess to you, not exactly on behalf of the panel, but speaking truthfully for the panel, that many of us didn't actually know what topic we were supposed to address today. And you will see that each of us is focusing on something slightly different. I actually want to talk about political magazines. The map of the world of opinion magazines is very different from what it once was. But it is not a smaller map. There are, of course, less magazines of the left and many more on the right. Many more on the right, particularly from younger writers and editors, some of them from the campus. They're a bit haughty, I think, sophomoric, and perhaps one might say, given the fact that these magazines on the right, self-conscious conservatives, tend even to the raunchy. The fact that there are a lesser number of left magazines and more magazines of the right mirrors or expresses the politics of the day. In one case, the decline of the left politically and intellectually. In any case, much of what once might have appeared in magazines of the left now appears in precious magazines written in a precious language for professors of English at Duke University. Deconstruction in behalf of left-wing politics, Foucault mustered for the third world. All magazines of opinion are precarious enterprises. One magazine which I grew up with no longer exists. It was called The Reporter. It was founded by an Italian liberal anti-fascist refugee from Italy called Max Ascoli, and it was a victim of the Vietnam War. Max Ascoli was for it. Whether he was right on that or not is not to the point now, but in the time in which he was writing, he had the temerity to think that the career of freedom in the world depended on the U.S. In my more than 20 years as editor of the New Republic, I've often been told that I am endangering the New Republic, that I am imperiling its influence, forfeiting its authority. And the reason was always the same. And here I think I'll even finger the culprit who's a friend and someone I respect very much, but whose comment hit me the hardest. Professor Galbraith said that by my obsession with Israel, I was destroying my influence on everything else. And of course, people said similar things when the New Republic came out for aid to the Contras, and all of our contributing editors, including Michael Walzer, wrote us a letter protesting what we had done. Opinion magazines are also characterologically marginal, and so you can also be threatened by being made more marginal. We once wrote once, I suppose 100 times, wrote a rather nasty thing about Edward Said, and Frederick Jameson wrote me a letter saying that he would never write for the New Republic. Now, I don't know how many of you know who Frederick Jameson is. I did not know who Frederick Jameson was, but I asked, and this thread of further marginalization was not very weighty. The big change, of course, in magazines of opinion is the fact that they used to be loosely affiliated with movements. And the fact is that there aren't very many movements around. And a movement is something different from an intellectual current or a moral sensibility or even a set of political ideas. This decline of movements is not all bad. At least it is not all bad for magazines. It makes them less like churches, where people go every week or every month to read exactly what they already fervently believe. But there are still some church-like magazines, nostalgic for a doctrine. The prime instance in my mind, although my business associates tell me that I should never compare the New Republic to the Nation in any way, the Nation seems to me to be a church-like magazine, nostalgic for a doctrine or at least an attitude. The Nation has spent its entire history going from country to country trying to find a favorable alternative model to the United States. You know, those journeys, that journey was very long. Republican Spain, the USSR, China, Cuba, Vietnam, going with exuberant certainty from hope, as Wordsworth put it, to frustrated hope. And I hope it won't be thought unpleasant of me to suggest that there is something of a church in the Jewish magazine whose 50th anniversary we are here marking. Take, for example, this peculiar doctrine that state and local governments are the possessors of wisdom and virtue, certainly superior to the wisdom and virtue that resides in the national government. Or that other doctrine that God is good for society, although it seems to me that the magazine is rather agnostic as to whether his words and his messages are intrinsically true. This is the doctrine of religion as a sociological absolute. And maybe even Dissent magazine, on whose contributing editor board I still am. I do not know whether Dissent still says of itself that socialism is the name of our desire, but it keeps alive, and I think for the good of all of us, the notion that privilege and greed are not ideal normative values of a society. The decline of movements also has another corollary, which is that the history of opinion magazines becomes the history of its editors. And so, since we are celebrating or marking the 50th anniversary.
God forbid we should celebrate.
Since we are marking the 50th anniversary of commentary, Norman Podhoretz's Odysseys are also quite relevant. Now, in my own intellectual and political life, Norman Podhoretz played a very big role. He published, over 2 years, a series of articles, later to be called revisionism, that argue that the U.S. had pushed an unaggressive Soviet Union into the Cold War. Now, Mr. Podhoretz no longer believes that, and I also don't believe what I believed then, but our Odysseys become important to us as a model of other people's Odysseys, although we may have been responsible for their opinions in the first place. I focus on Mr. Podhoretz simply because he is getting so much applause today. You could ask, what was I doing when he was publishing that? Well, I had no magazine. I was actually misleading my students. The editors who've experienced an epiphanous moment behave like others with epiphanous experiences. We are quite certain that we are right, although my own magazine is now faulted quite often for being without a coherent center. I'm almost done. Magazines like ours have lived their lives around some crucial issues. And there is one issue which has now been settled, and that is the issue of revolution. Do we want revolutions anywhere? And whether on the left and on the right, at least in this stream here, none of us do. And I'm willing to admit that on the issue of revolution, among the 5 magazines here represented, probably the New Republic had the worst record. It was for a long time enchanted with Stalin and Stalinism, and you have it from Hilton Kramer that I have rescued the magazine's history from that great era, and a great era it was. The issues that now face political magazines or opinion magazines are, in no particular order, the failure of nation building in Third World, the disenchantment with multilateralism and universalism, the decline of politics itself. I ask myself, what would happen, for example, if the person who I wanted as President of the United States were to become President of the United States? Well, one thing that would happen is I'd have influence, I suppose. But what great things would happen, and I can't come up with much. The transformation of advanced economies, the downward spiral of the middle class, the eclipse of dignified work for masses of people, the authority of genes and the power of science, and the new rancors of race. We are facing these matters on the morrow of a rightist sweep at the polls. There could be much debate about whether these rightists, these particular rightists, were influenced or are even influenceable by any serious journal of ideas, or ideas at all. By the way, I think it was different under Reagan, where at least they paid some attention to foreign policy ideas. It seems to me that as a group, this is a group now in power, which likes the idea of ideas. I doubt whether the principals have read many articles in commentary. They have never heard of dissent. Some of their staffs read my magazine only to detect those of our famous apostasies from liberalism, and I don't know whether the libraries of the 100 colleges in which Newt Gingrich teaches his course on the revival of American civilization even subscribe to partisan review. In a curious sense,
Get 3 copies.
in a curious sense, it is to the national interest the most wonky and nerdy of these magazines, the least ideological in a way, that we may look to trace the origins of public policy, but not only on the right. So much has not worked. So many public purposes are in question that government itself is suspect, but the government programs most suspect are those that help others. Those least suspect are those which are obscured and indecipherable. Thank you.
William Phillips.
As Marty Peretz has suggested, the subject of this evening's panel has changed almost as much as the political situation. So, originally, it was supposed to be about liberalism and conservatism. Then it was supposed to be about what neoconservatism has wrought. Now I just discovered 5 minutes ago that it's supposed to be about the influence of magazines. So I'll make just the briefest remark about the ostensible or the real subject of tonight's discussion about the influence, about the nature and influence of magazines. I'd like to call your attention to the fact that among non-commercial magazines, which represent a different species from what we're really talking about, that is, commercial magazines represent a different species. Among non-commercial magazines, there are 2 types of magazines. There are what I would call packages. That is, a few people get together and decide to have a magazine. They have a list of all the people, in the famous people in the country and in Europe, and they have a few friends, and they put out a magazine. I won't name names, but there are a lot of magazines of that kind. There are also magazines that are serious and dedicated, that have a purpose, that have values, have aims, and they're really represented on this panel tonight. And I must also include one that's represented in the audience by Hilton Kramer. That's the New Criterion. As for the influence of partisan review, I'm told that it originally had enormous influence. What its influence today is, I don't know. We were, I think this is an objective fact, I'm not just plugging my own publication, that we, in the late 30s and early 40s, created the first large or medium-sized intellectual community that was anti-Stalinist. And for a decade or so, I think we mitigated to a great extent or broke the back of Stalinist influence on intellectuals, the media, and the academy. Now, I can, if there are more questions about my magazine, I'll answer them during the question period. I want to go to one question that Norman Podhoretz raised, I think it was this afternoon, or was it yesterday? At a conference, you know, days flow into each other. Some of you were not here. He raised the question as to why intellectuals, for so long and persistently and up to the present, seem to gravitate towards the left. Well, I have two observations. I don't mean intellectuals, excuse me, why Jews gravitate towards the left.
Different.
Irving tells me there's a difference. Well, there are two reasons that I can think of why Jews have gravitated towards the left for a very long time, at least a century, if not more. One is that Jews, I don't know whether the bell curve has any statistics, any curves on the Jews, but Jews are not as smart as they think they are. That's one reason. The second reason is that since the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, it has been considered proper for intellectuals in general to take their place on the left. It's been considered more moral, if not necessarily an act of wisdom, to be on the left. Let me go back a little in time autobiographically. I may be the only person here, certainly on this panel, who had any real connection, real knowledge of the Communist Party. That was in the middle 30s. When Partisan Review began, for a year and a half was in the orbit of the Communist Party. It's an organ of the John Reed Writers Club. And I knew some of the leaders and middle leaders, especially the middle leaders, the middle bureaucracy of the Communist Party. And at the time, if I were to ask myself now, raise the question, why I turned left and why I was, for a year and a half, a fellow traveler of the Communist Party, the most I can say is that it seemed the right thing to do. I didn't go through any extensive rationalizations, any extensive analyses, which landed me in the ultra-left camp at the time. I simply seemed to me that for a writer, a young writer, if I may call myself a young intellectual at that time, that was the place where one had to be. I never believed that the communists could ever make a revolution in this country. That seemed to me utter nonsense. The Communist Party was dominated by Jews. Most of its members were Jews. And the Jewish clothing workers of New York, who represented its main human base, hardly spoke English, and it never occurred to me that they could make the American Revolution. Now I want to go on to one of the other topics of this evening's panel, on which I've written some notes. Clearly, neoconservatism has created a vital and necessary counterforce to the various leftist movements that have swept the academy and the media. I hope I'm not accused of hedging if I say that it's not easy to identify completely with conservatism, or more maybe specifically with the Republican Party. It's a little easier to identify with the neoconservatives, because as I shall mention later, there's we have to point out a difference between neoconservatism and traditional conservatism. Despite the fact that liberalism and the Democratic Party have been corrupted by trendy, radical, ideological movements. And here I want to point out that when we talk of liberalism, a certain confusion enters the discussion, because liberalism today is not traditional liberalism. Liberalism today is really leftism with a liberal face. Actually, Norman has accused me of taking a lofty, above-the-battle stance. He's partly right, but given my venerable age and my long history as a battler for the right causes, am I not entitled to a respite? In any event, he's only partly right, because some conservative or Republican positions seem to be at least arguable. But perhaps more important is that there is an opposition, in my opinion, a contradiction between complete identification with a specific political current or party and the ideal of intellectual independence that we all share. That was quite a Freudian slip, wasn't it? When I said dependence. Generally, in the past, liberalism has been associated with more government management and regulation, and with welfare reform, while conservatism has been more or less identified with the free market in the economy and the free market of ideas. Lately, however, there have been some shifts. As for government intervention, the difference is largely in rhetoric and emphasis, for it is widely recognized that in a large and complex society like the United States, a certain amount of government control is necessary, otherwise we'd have chaos, or we'd have the anarchism that some people advocate. But there has been an important shift, as I suggested earlier, in the Constitution, in the constituency of conservatism and liberalism. Liberalism today is largely identified with the pseudo-intellectual bureaucracy in the academy and in the media, while conservatism is identified to a large extent with the common sense as well as the prejudices of the general public. And while it is clear that we must dissociate ourselves from the leftist liberalism rampant today, the conservatism that is rooted in the general population does also raise many questions, or at least some questions. Let us begin with some specifics. There's no doubt that liberalism has been infected with many leftist and so-called liberating notions, which are in themselves highly questionable. And current liberalism must be distinguished, as I said before, from traditional liberalism, which, to be sure, has never been pure, but was not so much a leftist movement, as I said earlier, as it is today with the liberal face. And conservatives are to be commended for the vigor and clarity with which they have exposed the hidden agenda of most liberals, and particularly the false claims of the administration that has moved to the center. Especially welcome has been the criticism of the various telltale leftist appointments by the administration, and the campaign has had some effect against affirmative action, that parody of retroactive justice. Conservatives also have been in the forefront in the criticism of the various aspects of political correctness in the academy and the media. On the whole, conservatives, particularly the neoconservatives, have provided a relief from the steady drone of knee-jerk leftism that has developed that has enveloped some of our less independent intellectuals. I should add that we have to distinguish between the right as a whole, especially the far right, and neoconservatism. Of course, we must praise commentary for alerting us, among other things, to threats against Israel, and we must and the new criterion is to be admired for its superb art criticism and for constantly warning against the politicalization of art. But I also must mention some minuses, or at least some points at which I find myself in disagreement with many conservatives. One of the most important is that of abortion. Aside from the obvious question as to whether women have the right to a free choice, the anti-abortionists of the right appear to me advocating a foolish social policy. For one of the ways of keeping ghetto teenagers from having illegitimate children is obviously through abortion. In addition, I cannot understand the support of the Christian right, except on purely tactical grounds. If what I have read about Pat Robertson is correct, he is dangerously close to a conspiratorial theory about Jewish bankers, which makes one think of earlier theories of this kind. I'm aware that Robertson is supposed to be pro-Israel, which may be one of those strange contradictions we encounter in political life today. But in addition to these questions about social policy, there's the issue of intellectual independence. I'm not advocating aloofness from current political and social issues. That would be intellectually and politically irresponsible. Nor am I advocating a kind of meaningless centrism. What I'm suggesting is that intellectuals do not identify with any party or movement, though I have to say at this time, my own sympathies are with many of the things neoconservatives stand for. Let me close with a few things that I think would be useful for not only liberals, but neoconservatives to criticize on the right, that is, in the Republican Party. It seems to me one of the things that, one of the confusions that's brought into the cultural debate these days is the emphasis or the claim that people like Gingrich and other conservatives make that they represent the mainstream of American culture, which is not entirely true. They represent the mainstream of popular culture. And they also assume, and I've heard Gingrich say this on television, that what is wrong with the culture, what they call the elite culture, in the academy and in the, let me put it another way. What Gingrich and other Republicans assume is that the people who represent political correctness in the media and the academy represent elite culture in this country. And I would argue strenuously that elite culture is not represented by them. They represent a pseudo-culture in this country, a pseudo-avant-garde. And that's created a good deal of the confusion, which has made it almost impossible to continue the two endowments, the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for Education. So therefore, what I would like to close on is a plea against confusion on both the right and the left. Thank you.
Irving Kresto.
I have no intention of spreading confusion. I have in my day edited 4 magazines, and I can say of all of them, they have all lost money. So if it's the magazine business you're interested in, don't write me. I'm not your man. On the other hand, I believe all of these magazines have had an impact. Commentary, the first magazine I got a job on, has been enormously influential over the past, 45 years, 50? 50. 50 years, yes. And then, of course, there was Encounter magazine in England, which in its day played an important role. And then the Reporter, which Marty Peretz apparently was a subscriber to. And now the Public Interest, which has been in existence for 30 years. And I think all of them have been, in their own way, influential. Otherwise, why would I be editing them? You edit a small magazine to have influence. If you don't want influence, you can edit a big magazine, like the Reader's Digest, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with the Reader's Digest, but not if you want influence. I mean, that's doesn't matter. I mean, I've actually written a couple of articles for the Reader's Digest. They offered me a fee, so I wrote. No one ever commented on anything that appeared by me in the Reader's Digest. Whereas you write an article, put it in a small magazine with a circulation of 6 or 7 or 8,000, and you can create a firestorm. Time or Newsweek can pick it up and comment on it. When I was back at Commentary, as a very young man, I wrote an article on religion and found my picture in the religious section of Time magazine. This you get from small magazines. And I'm a small magazine man. I try not to read the big magazines. I'm hoping that people will summarize them if they have interesting articles and tell me all the gossip that may be contained in them. But the magazines my heart is really in are the magazines with circulations of 6, 7, 8,000. And this begins with Partisan Review, which I read when I was an undergraduate at City College, and which for me was the most important magazine in the world. It was the magazine that introduced me to modernism in the arts and in literature. Caused me to read Kafka, Dostoevsky, Faulkner, W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, who were not taught in the classrooms at City College in those days. As I recall,
They were not yet dead white men.
well, they weren't dead white men, but also, basically, City College, a very traditional college in those days, sort of ended its literary courses with Browning. Why go after that? You don't know who's good, who's going to survive, who's worthwhile. And they were right. They were absolutely right. Great mistake, I think, in modern university is trying to teach all the exciting books in your classroom. The really interesting books should be read outside the classroom. The more boring books that you really should know about if you're going to be a cultivated person should be in the classroom. That's what classrooms are for, to read Beowulf. You're never going to read Beowulf elsewhere or any other time. Whereas you might very well read Kafka or T.S. Eliot on your own, which is the way you should read it. It depresses me to watch young people these days keep going back to graduate school in order to read books when all they have to do is walk into the nearest bookstore and get it all in paperback. However, let's talk politics. But in any case, Partisan Review was, had an influence on me in my years at City College as no other journal has ever had, because it combined anti-Stalinist but left-wing, basically Trotskyist politics with an attention to avant-garde art and modernist literature, a very heady combination. When I was at City College, was a young Trotskyist. And I still read when people refer to me as Irving Kristol, former Trotskyist, now a well-known neoconservative. I smile. I was 21 when I resigned from the Trotskyists. But they don't know that, of course. All they know is that I was once a Trotskyist at City College, which is true. And it was very interesting and a great experience. I enjoyed every minute of it. I read a lot of good books, read a lot of bad books, but important bad books like Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kautsky, you name it. And what is true is that with every magazine I have edited, ever since my disillusionment, or not disillusionment, I was never seriously disillusioned. I just got disengaged. It seemed so foolish. I knew they weren't making a world revolution. I could see that they weren't going to make a world revolution, all 97 of us. And if you look at those magazines, you look at my association with them, there's a steady drift to the right over the years. So eventually I became something called a neoconservative, and now I guess I still am a neoconservative, and I'm not going to move further to the right and become what? A conservative? What's the point? I mean, it's sexier to be a neoconservative than to be a conservative. Anybody can be a conservative. You don't even have to think to be a conservative. But to be a neoconservative, you have to have read a few books, read a few magazines, show some intellectual alertness, just to earn that neo. And on the whole, I think it's been a very healthy evolution. I think it's a natural evolution. I think when you grow up, you should become more mature. And when you become more mature, you should become more conservative in every respect. I've known older men, many of them my contemporaries, some even older, who to their last days were so eager to change the world radically, so eager to make a new world. Honestly, Michael Oakeshott, when he gave his first lecture, succeeding Harold Lasky at the London School of Economics, concluded his lecture with a magnificent line. This is the best of all possible worlds, and everything in it is a necessary evil. And that impressed me. I mean, yeah, it's a great world. I can't think of a better one. I watch science fiction on television. I read science fiction books. They're not better worlds. This is better. On the other hand, it's full of evils. And obviously, the world wouldn't be there if it weren't for evils. As the Talmud said, the world came into being because of the evil inclination. But it is sustained by good deeds. Public Interest, my most recent magazine, if I may call it that, started in 1965 out of a dissatisfaction with the Great Society programs as were then being proposed. By the way, the magazine deals only with domestic policy, not foreign, partly because of the Vietnam War. We did not want to get into arguments about the Vietnam War, would have taken up all the pages in the magazine. In any case, the Vietnam War was being discussed adequately elsewhere. But at that time, Daniel Bell and I, Daniel Bell, now emeritus professor of sociology here, thought that there was something wrong with the basic ideas that seemed to be floating around the 1960s. And this was really before the 1960s went cuckoo. I mean, this was before the so-called counterculture ripped apart the universities. Strange things were happening. Suddenly there was the notion of that automation was going to transform our society. We were going to be living in a push-button society, and this was going to cause enormous problems. And books began to appear, financed by the Ford Foundation and other such worthy institutions, on the problem of leisure. Big books, very fat books. I attended myself 2 conferences on the problem of leisure. And at both conferences, I was never invited back after my first appearance there. I indicated skepticism that there would ever be such a problem. And why? Because I said, the world is not like that. The world is not so constituted that we're going to be sitting around becoming wealthy without working. The Bible says you can't do it, and I believe that. And just enjoy life and trying to figure out what to do with our idle time. I just don't believe that. It's not going to happen. And it didn't happen, of course. Sometimes, you know, Rudyard Kipling has a wonderful poem called The Gods of the Copybook Headings. Back in the old days when you got a school book, a little copybook to do your homework in. Now, in those days it was thought that schools are to improve the character of the children. And so there'd be a copybook heading, like, he who hesitates is lost, or the early bird catches the worm. Words of wisdom, which were printed on the head of each section. So you'll sort of remember them. You learn something even if you're not paying attention while copying in your headache. And the point of the Kipling poem, which I strongly recommend to you, was recommended to me first by Lionel Trilling. I was not familiar with him. Is that in the end, the old cliches turn out to be true. Whatever your grandmother told you is probably truer than anything you have thought of on your own. Not that she was necessarily smarter than you, but behind her there stands generations of very smart people. And these copybook headings that come down through those generations distill the wisdom of those generations, and they become available to you. And so I knew there was not going to be a problem of leisure, but we had to cope with it. In fact, President Johnson said, established a committee on automation, a commission on automation, which fortunately Dan Bell was a member of, as was Robert Solow here at MIT. And between the two of them, they managed to write a fairly sensible report. But the report that the people who had set up the commission wanted was that we have a crisis, the crisis of a society in which all the production will be done by pushing a few buttons, and we will have a surplus of unemployable human beings, and we have to figure out what to do with these human beings. Well, of course, that didn't happen, and it's not going to happen. But in any case, we thought something's wrong here. Also, the war on poverty struck us as a very peculiar enterprise. The little group that started the public interest, Dan Bell, Nathan Glazer, myself, Seymour Martin Lipset, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, James Q. Wilson, Roger Starr, about 7 or 8 people who were the original group. And the way you started the magazine was to ring up these people and say, we got a magazine, write an article. So they wrote an article. And they were all, of course, very famous now. We all came from lower middle class or working class families. We knew something about poverty. We were familiar with poverty. We'd seen poor people. The war on poverty was drafted by Harvard professors or Harvard graduates who knew nothing about poor people, didn't understand poor people, didn't know what made them tick, didn't know how poor people go about becoming not poor. And we decided that something was wrong with this notion that, for instance, through community action, which is to say, through militant politics, poor people can become non-poor, was idiotic. Militant action does not make poor people not poor, except for the handful who are the leaders of the political action, usually demagogic leaders. And so we said, it's all on the wrong track, well-meaning, of course. We got ourselves as liberals. I was a friend of Hubert Humphrey's. But there was something going on in the New Society programs that bothered us. And so we started this magazine, which took a critical look at New Society programs. But then, of course, as the Democratic Party and the American government started moving further and further to the left under various influences, with the government becoming ever more intrusive, ever more remindful of its, quote, obligations, unquote, we began to say something is very wrong. And so we drifted sort of rightward, I think it's fair to say that, and arrived at something that you might want to call neoconservatism, though most of the people, not most, I think of the original founders, probably only half would regard themselves, even today, as neoconservatives. But the others, nevertheless, have been called so with considerable justice, in my opinion. And we only have, well, I only have one rule for neoconservatism. You must be cheerful. I do not believe conservatism can work in this country if it's pessimistic or dour or disagreeable or unpleasant. It should be fun. It should be enjoyable. It should be exciting. And that was the only rule I established for the magazine. I want the ideas to be exciting. I don't care if they're liberal or conservative, but I want, well, I do care, but I prefer that. I'd be dismayed if the only exciting articles that came in were liberal. I'd send them all to Marty. But in fact, more of the exciting articles that come into me these days are, in truth, conservative. And neoconservatism in this peculiar way has become an influence. We have influenced the New Republic. People ask me, what have you done? Show me. And I point to the New Republic. I say, you think the New Republic today is the way it was 15, 20 years ago? It's different. What way is it different? They'll say it's more conservative. And those liberals who say the New Republic has moved to the right are right. The New Republic has moved to the right. And it's moved to the right because it's run by very intelligent people who read the public interest and are influenced. That's how the world is shaped. Incidentally, the same thing is true of Newsweek or Time. Those people cannot be illiterate forever. I mean, since they have to write articles, they have to read something. And so gradually they begin to read articles and they say, no, that's a pretty cogent argument. And sooner or later they find themselves not thinking quite the way they did before they sat down to write that article in previous weeks. So we have had our influence. I must say, in all fairness, the influence was limited. We have never influenced dissent. Dissent is impregnable. Right. We're never going to influence I don't want to influence dissent. There should be one pure socialist journal, utterly irrelevant to the world, but nevertheless retaining the flame and reminding us of what it once meant to be a socialist. I think, and it's in English. I think it's very useful to have. I'm glad it exists. I myself would not pay for its subsidy, but never mind, I have my own problems raising money. But I'm rather cheerful about the way this country is going at the moment. Things are so to say. It may be that we're going to hell, but if so, we're going very slowly. And it can take a long time for civilization to collapse. And there's nothing to stop you from enjoying yourself while it does, and you can. It's out of your hands. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. The important thing, however, is to do what you can do to make life more livable for yourself and for your fellow citizens, not only of the United States, but of the world. And in this respect, being realistic about the world, and which means not having utopian illusions about human beings, not having utopian illusions about political options, not having utopian illusions about political possibilities, not making assumptions of what you can do when in fact you can't do anything. I think you can lead a perfectly good and respectable intellectual life while observing all of these self-imposed restrictions. And I mean, I do not pretend that the Republican Party has been converted to neoconservatism. The Republican Party doesn't like anything beginning with the word neo, which has a foreign accent to it. Doesn't sound like a wholesome American word. And it's not, of course. But never mind. I think we've made a lot of progress, and I think we've had our share of influence. And if things don't work out, now blame somebody else, blame Marty Peretz. Things may not work out despite our best efforts. But that's life. You do what you can do. You do what you think is the only thing you can do. You look for results, and you pay the penalty, or you reap the reward. Thank you.
Michael Walzer.
Well, I will understandably be less cheerful and less complacent than Irving Kristol. Dissent is a magazine that I would happily describe as not responsible for what is now going on in Washington. There's some moral satisfaction in that, but it's also a sign of political defeat, and that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. I shall try to describe the defeat and then say something about the present condition and the possible future of the American left. I mean the liberal left, our own version of social democracy. The electoral disaster of November 1994 was not brought about by some massive conversion of Americans to right-wing ideas. The number of people who changed their minds between 1990 and 94 is relatively small, between 92 and 94, smaller. What happened instead is that the electorate as a whole moved rightward, shedding voters on the left, picking up new voters on the right. The size of the electorate remained roughly the same, something over 1/3 of its potential size, but its composition changed. Fewer blacks voted, fewer union members voted, a double decline. There are fewer union members, and a smaller proportion of them turned out. Fewer women voted, and the dropouts were black women or union members or from union families, so the gender gap narrowed. And fewer Jews voted. And at the same time, the evangelical and fundamentalist churches and sects turned out a lot of new voters, previously alienated and withdrawn from secular politics. I don't think that the neoconservatives brought a lot of new voters to the polls, but they did provide a certain intellectual cover for the Christian right. I suppose on the Leninist principle, if principle was involved, that every possible source of discontent must be mobilized for the cause. And also with the private conviction that Christian fundamentalism can be used and eventually discarded. On that last point, I have to hope that they are right, but the whole spectacle was not pleasant to the eye. What happened on the left looked to us very frightening. The withdrawal of so many left-leaning voters is the culmination, or maybe not yet the culmination, of a long process which we have been worrying about in the pages of Dissent for a long time, and were still surprised last November. That process is the demobilization of the American left, which goes a long way toward explaining the pusillanimity of so many liberal politicians these days. We see that demobilization in the decline of the unions. After a series of political and economic defeats, one of the most important, the air controllers' strike, coming at the hands of the government, American conservatives are very selectively critical of governmental power. The virtual collapse of the civil rights movement, and the dramatic weakening of the black churches in which it was rooted. the failure of the so-called new social movements, feminists and environmentalists, to produce strong, coherent, politically educated, and disciplined constituencies, and a decline in the number of Americans who participate actively in a great variety of mutual aid associations, who volunteer time and energy to fraternal and sororal organizations, church charities, neighborhood groups, and so on. The result of all this is that ordinary Americans have never in my lifetime been so unorganized, passive, politically powerless, so vulnerable to socioeconomic forces over which they have no control, so cut off from any sort of solidarity or civic friendship as they are now. And as a result, they have never been so fearful and resentful, so ready to look for and punish scapegoats, as we saw last November: illegal immigrants, welfare mothers, homosexuals, blacks. A declining standard of living for most Americans, greater wealth for a very few, increasing inequality in the society as a whole. All this also follows from the demobilization of the left, and it is probably true that liberals and conservatives distinguish themselves most clearly by how they respond to this new, still emerging social profile. But I want to focus on the demobilization itself. I was raised on that old leftist imperative, organize. And so I feel some special sensitivity to and anxiety about contemporary disorganization. It's this condition that has opened the way for a well-organized band of right-wing intellectuals to lift themselves into prominence and to have some impact on national politics. The success of any intellectual vanguard depends on and is a function of the weakness of the underlying social structure. I'm trying to sound now like the old professor of social studies here at Harvard that I am. I think of the neoconservatives as the Bolsheviks of the American right, and I mean that quite precisely. Like the Bolsheviks, they understand the importance of ideology. Like the Bolsheviks, they believe themselves to have the correct ideological position. It's one of the more amazing features of the contemporary political scene that the war against political correctness was fought with great success by men and women absolutely sure of their own political correctness. And like the Bolsheviks, when they fight ideological battles, they aim to kill their opponents. I mean intellectually, politically. Nothing less than total victory will do. Hence the fierceness of their polemics. It's an old left fierceness. I recognize it immediately and know it well, now carried to the other side of the political spectrum. Curiously, we don't write that way anymore in the pages of dissent. We have been invaded by ideological uncertainty. Not about whether we like or dislike the growing inequalities of American society, but about whether we really know the single correct path to more egalitarian social arrangements. Uncertainty is morally and intellectually sympathetic, again, but politically disabling. Against the neoconservatives, we need to recapture that old fierceness. For example, a certain sort of right-wing populism aimed with great calculation against intellectual, cultural, and governmental elites sits easily these days alongside an extraordinary deference to the real elites of American society, the rich and the powerful. But why is this coexistence so easy? How can Republican politicians defend the heartland and the common people and American values while they organize a massive redistribution of wealth from the many to the few? That they can do this so easily is a sign of an intellectual as well as a political failure. We on the left lack satirical wit, the capacity for mockery and ridicule. But we're going to have many occasions to cultivate that capacity. in the next months and years. I am still enough of a Marxist, just enough, to believe that our ideological uncertainties won't be resolved until there are new social movements, new organizations of active citizens with which we can connect. But there are things we can do and should do before that, and most crucially, two things. We must work at ideological renewal. That's been the main project of dissent for the last several years. Rethinking every aspect of the doctrines of the left of the past 50 years. We have to think about how we can make a decent accommodation with localism and particularism while still upholding our commitment to an inclusive national community, and about how we can engage more people in the associational life of civil society and make those associations meaningful in the everyday work of self-government, mutual aid, environmental defense, and so on. And about how the institutions and practical arrangements of the welfare state can be recast, decentralized, without a further decline in its already inadequate standards of provision and a loss of reach and coverage. And about how markets can be organized and constrained, for the market is the most disruptive of social forces, constantly undermining communal stability and efforts at mutual aid. How markets can be organized and constrained so that they are not incompatible with economic cooperation and greater equality. And about how a decent standard of living for ordinary Americans and public health and environmental safeguards and safety in the workplace and employment security and social security can be maintained in a global economy when globalism has become an excuse for giving up on all of those things. So that is our intellectual work. But we have also to mount a spirited defense, as best we can, of people in trouble, or soon to be in trouble, in this period of conservative hegemony. For make no mistake, these contemporary conservatives are not interested in conserving the very limited gains that popular forces in this country have made since the 1930s. The Reagan years saw an attack on the achievements of Johnson's Great Society. We will now see an attack on the achievements of the New Deal. Our immediate politics, therefore, is bound to be defensive. Defensive even of practices and institutions that we have criticized in the past and hope to transform. They can't be transformed unless they exist, and we will now be defending their existence. But we should be very clear about the political and moral grounds of our defensiveness, which are also the grounds of our criticism. Writing in dissent almost 40 years ago, the Italian intellectual and novelist Ignazio Silone argued that there is nothing more important in politics than the choice of comrades. He told a story about how, as a child, he once made a joking remark about a small, barefoot, ragged little man who was being led away to prison, handcuffed between two policemen. His father was very angry. Never make fun of a man who's been arrested. Never. Why not? Because he can't defend himself, and because he may be innocent. In any case, because he is unhappy. In the United States today, we have the largest prison population among the developed democracies of the Western world, and it will soon be much larger. We have the largest underclass. We have the largest number of homeless men, women, and children. The children will soon be in orphanages. We will soon have the largest number of children in orphanages. We have the largest number of people without health insurance. We have the largest number of functionally illiterate school children. We have the most, or soon to be the most, inegalitarian distribution of wealth among the developed democracies. We have the lowest percentage of organized workers. We have the lowest rates of electoral participation, which means the highest rates of political alienation, withdrawal, and passivity. And all this hangs together. It makes for a disordered, society and for an unjust society, in which a lot of people are in trouble, a lot of people are, in any case, unhappy. To be a liberal today, which I mean to be on the left today, is to choose those people as one's comrades. The choice doesn't have to be and should not be uncritical. Many of those people bear substantial responsibility for their own lives. To choose them as comrades means to help them take responsibility, which they can only do in the style of the old left, collectively through political organization. All of us have to make this choice. It's not a question facing this panel of editors about what magazine you choose to read. That's not entirely unimportant, but it's not very important. It's a choice of where you stand and with whom you stand in the political struggles to come. And I continue to hope that enough of you will choose with a large moral sympathy so that what the neoconservatives have wrought will turn out to be ephemeral, impermanent, a passing moment in our national life.
Norman Podhoretz.
Well, as if I did not know it before, the applause meter tells me that the left still lives at Harvard, however much trouble it may be elsewhere. I wish Michael good luck in this long agenda of ideological reconstruction he set for himself. Sounds like it might take about a century to complete, which is okay with me. As for the list of problems and pathologies in our society that he gave us, I would have been more impressed if he had shown at least a glimmer of recognition of the extent to which the policies of the left have either created or exacerbated a good many of those problems. But I'm going to do something almost unheard of in meetings like this. I'm actually going to try to address myself to the subject as listed in the program. Can a magazine influence America? Liberalism, Conservatism, and the present moment. And since this entire conference was, much to my delight and gratitude, called in commemoration of Commentary's 50th anniversary, I hope I will be forgiven for using Commentary as the example of how a magazine can indeed influence America. Actually, as Marty Peretz was unkind enough to remind everyone, or to tell some people who did not yet know, I committed a good many intellectual, political, ideological sins when I was a young editor 35 years ago. I've been I've often said that I've spent much of the rest of my career not only atoning for those sins, but trying to undo whatever damage I managed to accomplish, including over the mind of Marty Peretz in the succeeding years. But I'm glad that he cited that early period, because I wasn't going to talk about that, but it occurs to me that I have lived through two major changes in the political, cultural climate of this country, and have been involved in both of those changes as the editor of Commentary. And the first one was indeed the movement to the left that took place in the late 50s and early 60s. Some of the ideas that we were pushing, exploring, propagating in Commentary in the early 60s were so remote from power, or the possibility of power, that the speed with which they achieved influence and eventually great political power astonished me then and astonishes me even today in retrospect, just as a measure of that, in the year 1960, I think it was, I went to a meeting of what was then called the Peace Movement, to which I was recruited by Nathan Glazer, sitting here somewhere. The Peace Movement, it was working for a test ban treaty and disarmament, Vietnam was not yet on the horizon, but when the Vietnam War began, members of that movement were very early, including myself, became very early opponents of the war. But during that early period, just to give you a sense of what it was like, I went to a meeting. It was in an old Union Hall on 14th Street in Manhattan. In fact, I was there to debate an old pacifist, and forget now, it was about, I don't even remember what the subject was, but there were, I don't know, 20 people there. It was a grungy setting. Everybody looked very unhappy, including me, and I had taken along my late colleague, Marion Maggott, and she looked around this place and she said to me, "Do you realize that every person in this room is a tragedy to some family or other?" And that was a good description of what the audience looked like. 5 years later, a comparable meeting would have attracted large numbers of upper middle class students in places like this, would and did. I would certainly not claim that commentary was responsible for that change in the climate, which eventually led to the capture of the Democratic Party by the left, which had been so small and scraggly in the late 50s and early 60s. But we had something to do with it, and something that I've, as I say, regretted my share in that development ever since. And working against it, which I began to do in association with others who came to be called neoconservatives in the late 60s, we felt similarly, and I think correctly, like a small minority, certainly within the world of ideas, within the intellectual community, a small and embattled minority. Whenever I hear the neoconservatives attacked for their fierceness, even been called Bolsheviks tonight, that's a new one on me, but perhaps the worst name I've ever been called. But whenever I hear us attacked for the fierceness of our polemics and the way we fight to kill, I'm reminded of what Pat Moynihan used to say when he was ambassador at the UN and was being attacked, was being accused by the liberal press of being nasty to all the third world countries. And he used to like to quote a little, it wasn't poem exactly, maxim in French. My French isn't good enough, so I'll quote it in English. "How wicked is this animal? When you attack him, he fights back." And I think that's a bit of the case with the fierceness of the neoconservatives as polemicists. We were certainly fiercely attacked, and we did indeed fight back, which never failed and never fails to this day to astonish our opponents on the left, who don't know what to make of people who fight back in the ideological sphere. I want to give 3 examples of how the kind of influence that a magazine can exert works, and how it works in conjunction with events out there in the real world. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was declining support in this country, partly because of Vietnam, partly because of the growth and influence of some of the revisionist ideas about the Cold War that Marty Peretz referred to, that some of us helped to set into motion in the early 60s. There was a declining support in this country for military spending or any kind of tough policy toward the Soviet Union. I'm not very good at remembering numbers, but the polls showed very, very low degree of support for increases in military spending in the early 70s. Some of us began a long campaign of argument about the need for strengthening America's defenses against what we, often to great ridicule, thought of as an increasingly threatening and aggressive Soviet Union. That was not the general view. Incidentally, these were the years of the Nixon administration, so it wasn't the left only that we were criticizing, but it was a Republican administration which was pursuing a policy of détente. And very few of us believed that we were going to succeed in this campaign. We were not cheerfully optimistic, but we were grimly determined. And within something like 8 or 10 years, it was not only the election of Ronald Reagan, but the election of Ronald Reagan was preceded by a gradual growth in the degree of support for military spending and a gradual growth in apprehensiveness about the Soviet Union. You could see it. The graph went up that way, slowly but surely. And after the invasion of Afghanistan and the seizure of the American hostages in Iran, these twin events, which happened about 6 weeks apart, as I recall, there was a very dramatic change in the climate. And some of the things that we had been saying for 10 years that had been rejected by certainly the established centers of opinion and had no support in mass public opinion suddenly became respectable. And not only respectable, but sufficiently influential to have concrete effects in the real world in the form of Ronald Reagan's policies when he became president. Another illustration, I'm going to analyze that dynamic in a minute, but let me give you, I was going to give you 3, but I'm only going to give you 2 because we're running late. The second one has to do with affirmative action. Around the year 1970, or 69, I don't know, I wrote a piece and published another. These were, I think, perhaps the earliest attacks on the idea of affirmative action, the idea and the reality of affirmative action. And in one of these articles, I mentioned that Harvard was using double standards in its admissions procedures. And I happened to be acquainted with the then dean of admissions here, and he called me up and he said, "Oh, no, you're wrong. We're not doing that." And anyway, I think you're very wrong about your whole analysis is wrong. And look, why don't you come up here and I'll get my staff together and why don't we talk this out? And being relatively young then and foolish, I agreed to do that. And so up I came to Cambridge and met with the dean of admissions and his staff. There were, I don't know, 15 of them or something around a table. And I explained to them in what I thought were moderate and measured terms why I was against this new thing, affirmative action. I said, roughly, I said I was against it as a liberal. I was still calling myself a liberal in those days because as a liberal I believed in the old liberal catechism of individual rights as opposed to group rights, which I thought were consonant both with the constitutional tradition and the best liberal traditions. I said I was against it as an intellectual because it led to a lowering of standards, which would damage the culture. And I said that I was against it as a Jew because it would lead to discrimination against Jews, and I could not accept the idea that my son or my children had to be discriminated against as a necessary means to social justice. That was my pitch. When I finished, all hell broke loose, and you wouldn't truly have thought that I had been reading aloud passages from Mein Kampf, from the way that group reacted. They went berserk. And I was quite astonished at the violence of their reaction, and I dealt with it as best I could. But it was only the beginning of a long a series of such experiences and encounters over the next 25 years in this case. And I tell you the truth, I never thought I would live to see the day when there would be a serious chance of undoing this, what I consider wrong and even vicious policy Yet I have not only lived to see the prospect of this occurring, but even someone like Susan Estrich recently saying that she, who would manage the Mondale campaign and who is sufficiently, wasn't it the Mondale campaign? Beg your pardon? Carter? Dukakis. Well, they all look alike to me. She's also famous for her position on date rape. I think it was Susan Estrich who said that maybe means no, no means no, and even yes means no. Let me get a laugh out of that. This is really... Anyway, Susan Estrich recently was quoted in the New York Times as believing that affirmative action had gone far enough and it was perhaps time to put an end to it. Now, my argument would be that when either some great event like the invasion of Afghanistan or the seizure of American hostages in Iran, these are great historic events, or when some feeling reaches a critical mass, or some critical point, as in the case of affirmative action, the climate of opinion will not change unless there is ready a structure of ideas, a coherent structure of ideas that can explain the reality better than the old structure, and that can be leaned upon to legitimate the new set of feelings, legitimate them, make them not only thinkable but sayable, and not only sayable but sayable with a good conscience. And I believe that it is this job that magazines, which attempt to, intellectual magazines, which attempt to exert influence, is this job through which they manage to exert that influence when they do. I think that, well, I've got these notes, I've got 3 or 4 other examples, but as I say, there's not enough time to go into them. Let me just conclude by saying that I agree with Irving Kristol that conservatism, neoconservatism, ought to be cheerful, and I must say I am, for all my, I'm well known for being gloomy about the future and about the current condition of American society. But I do believe, without trying to claim any kind of direct credit for what happened last November, I have to say that I and a lot of people I'm associated with around Commentary Magazine do feel vindicated. Michael Walzer is very unhappy and thinks it's all ugly. I am very cheerful, and I think that we're seeing something very promising begin to happen in this country, which is an effort to undo the enormous damage which has been done by the policies of the left for at least the last 30, 35 years, and some damage that goes back, indeed, even to the New Deal. I don't know what exactly will happen as this damage is being undone. I hope it can be undone in a way that minimizes suffering, certainly minimizes unnecessary suffering. I don't know what kinds of accommodations individuals, groups, the society as a whole will make to these new circumstances, except I have enough faith in the resourcefulness and the flexibility, and if you like, the creativity of most people out there to make the necessary accommodations in a healthy and productive spirit, and with healthier and more attractive consequences than most people on the left now anticipate. It's not that I or anyone else I know, Marty, thinks that states and localities have superior wisdom to the federal government, though I must say it's pretty easy to cite almost anyone who might have superior wisdom to the federal government. It is precisely because most of us no longer believe in centers of superior political wisdom that we think that a multiplicity of centers of power and decision are more likely to come up through their various experiments, more likely to come up with something useful and something that might even, for a change, work. I think that those of us who have labored to bring about this, I call it counter-revolution rather than revolution, because I think it's a counter-revolution against the institutional legacies of liberalism. Those of us who have worked so hard for so many years to bring this about are naturally cheerful, and I would venture the prediction that our cheerfulness will be vindicated in the coming years. Thank you very much.
We're going to take the time for 2 questions, if you want to approach the microphone. Some 2 of you. Yes, sir.
Okay, first of all, I would like especially to hear Mr. Waltzer's response, but I'd be glad to hear everyone's. My basic contention is that there's a sort of a big lie today promulgated by the media, less at your level, more on upper levels, but basically every time a liberal Democrat goes down to defeat, it's not because of a position on defense, it's a rejection of New Deal values. It's not because of his position on crime or affirmative action, it's a rejection of New Deal values. It's not even a specific rejection of, say, Sister Soldier or Louis Farrakhan, it's a rejection of New Deal values. There seems to be this consensus that the quote-unquote social liberal, the fiscal conservative is the American of today, and it seems that all other opinions are being shut out to the point of ridicule too much across the media. I think in large part that accounts for the alienation that Mr. Walter is talking about. I'd just like you to agree or disagree or discuss among yourselves. Thank you.
I never heard that phrase, New Deal values. I don't believe it's in current usage in political debate, New Deal values. Newt Gingrich has praised Franklin D. Roosevelt, as did President Reagan. There is a movement among conservatives to restructure many of the programs of the New Deal, but not to simply return to the pre-New Deal era. That will displease Michael Walzer, who believes that conservatism should conserve. Well, that's a great way to kill conservatism. There are conservatives who believe that. They believe that conservatism should not be an active system of thought. It should simply be a nostalgic yearning for something that happened before there were liberals, so many liberals around. I really don't understand quite the thrust of your question. I'm not even sure I'm giving you the answer, but I am giving the answer to Michael Walzer. The conservatism that is emerging in the United States today is not a conservatism that wants to stand pat. It's not a conservatism that is stuck in the mud. It wants to reinvent, reconstruct whole sections of American government, and perhaps some sections of American society as well. It is very much a reforming conservative. Now, you may not like the reforms, but then no one likes, you can't have reform that everyone likes. And I do not, I cannot believe that here at Harvard so many people should, really agree with Michael's awfully depressing picture of the American electorate and of the American people. I'm sorry, but I get around the country. It's not the America I see. And I believe it's not the America you see either.
Well, I agree that American conservatism is not today a conservative movement in the sense that that term has in Europe. It is the most radical political movement in American life today. The movement most committed to transforming this society and creating a world in which individuals, heroic individuals, will stand on their own, take responsibility, each for himself, a few for herself, and stand or fall on the basis of their ability to survive in the market. And people who fall will be allowed to fall with the most modest effort. It shouldn't hurt too much my pocketbook. The most modest effort to stop them from falling into literal starvation. That's what I think we are moving toward. We are moving toward a dismantling of the only power which is capable of challenging the power that comes out of the marketplace, and that is the government. A systematic campaign to devalue governmental activities of every sort. I heard one Republican congressman, one of the Newt Gingrich people, say on television that this devolution of power to the states, that was only a temporary measure because the real aim was to get it to individuals, which means no government at all or an absolutely minimal government, and no power capable of balancing, of counteracting corporate power. I really think that that is the long-term program, and it is indeed a very radical and very scary program, because it means that that we are going to see more people on the streets, or maybe not, more people in institutions like prisons and orphanages, which are the two governmental institutions most praised in Washington today. More people in institutions of that sort, more crime, more disorder in our cities, and more disorganization in our population. The figures that the trends that I described and that Irving doesn't believe in are increasingly being confirmed by contemporary social science. There are declines in every aspect of American associational life. The number of people who vote, the number of people who go to PTA meetings, the number of people who read newspapers, the number of people who are involved, contributing time and energy to charitable organizations of all sorts. The number of people in unions, obviously, the number of people engaged, active in political parties. The graphs go downward over the last 20 years in a quite frightening way. And I think that any serious politics today has to focus on the question of how one recreates associational ties among Americans. And that is indeed the old project of the old left.
Yes, quickly, please.
This comment has to do with the strange bedfellow allegiance between neoconservatism and the Christian right in this country. And a number of the editors here and the journals here have either supported or at least tiptoed around the nature of the Christian right for a number of years for the simple reason that the Christian right and the Christian fundamentalist right has been a staunch supporter of Israel and continues to be so. But as a recent article by a one-time neoconservative has demonstrated, Pat Robertson and a good deal of the Christian fundamentalist right in this country represents an unabashed and extremely ugly form of protocols of the Elder of Zion filtered through a Masonic Illuminati conspiracy that sees Jews and European bankers at the heart of the problems of Western civilization. And while it may be that these people, although it seems, have in fact supported the state of Israel, I wonder if it is in the best interest of anyone, either intellectual or Jewish, to support people who, if in power, could well deny both the rights to speak those things and the rights of Jews to speak them. And so to end with Irving Kristol's strong support of cliches as embodying age-old wisdom, if you make a deal with the devil, you will eventually have to pay the piper.
Eventually have to what?
Pay the piper. Pay the piper.
That's not a traditional.
I would ask?
What do you want me to say?
Did he ask? Okay.
Pat Robertson? I don't know Pat Robertson. He seems to have all sorts of kooky ideas. I do know quite a lot of Christian conservatives. They do not have kooky ideas. Pat Robertson, in my opinion, is not representative of the more active people whom I see in Washington among Christian conservatives. That they're Christian, that doesn't bother me. I'm Jewish. Why should it bother me that they're Christian? I want Jews to be Jewish, so I'd like Christians to be Christian. That's all right. I can't very well go around saying Jews should be Jewish, but Christians shouldn't be Christian, because it might make Jews feel uncomfortable. They're not a problem. They have certain ideas. I don't agree with all of them. Don't agree with them entirely on abortion. But it's all right. I agree with them on school prayer, up to a point, I think. Actually, I agree with them on school prayer. I don't know. I went through public school system in New York City when we had school prayer. It was perfectly okay. No one bothered. And usually you just read the Psalms, which is okay. You go through the valley of death enough. It's a useful reminder that life is like that. So I wouldn't, everyone, it's a bugaboo, the Christian right. What have they done? What are they, I mean, what are they, why do they alarm you? They are a perfectly legitimate group of people who feel that the Supreme Court plus the educational institutions have so secularized our educational system so that the kids get an anti-religious education when they are sent to public schools, which I think is the truth. I would be for vouchers, which means parents can send their kids to any kind of school they wish, public or private. What's your concern?
I think Pat Robertson can no more be associated with the fundamentalist Christian right. It did not say Christian politicians. Then many of the people here can be disassociated from the neoconservative movement.
I'd like to shift the topic a little bit. Can I, Harvey?
Be my guest.
It seems to me that one of the issues of the Christian right and other Christians is the issue of the relentless attacks on decency in our society. The images of violence, the images of cruel sexuality, which we see just by turning on the television. I haven't heard from conservatives of your stripe whether these images, which are created and subsist on the rules of the free market, I haven't heard from any of you, really, how society can defend itself against this kind of vulgarity, dehumanization, ugliness. Do you have a critique
Certainly.
of this?
No society can defend itself against vulgarity. Vulgarity comes from vulgar people. And if you have vulgar people, what are you going to do with them? It's not a crime to be vulgar. If you're talking about obscenity or pornography, that's another matter. All societies traditionally have regulated through some form of censorship pornography and obscenity. I agree with you. There's much too much violence on television. There's no question in my mind, but that violence on television provokes violence among the younger viewers. And there's, in fact, a lot of good empirical evidence to that effect. We had a wonderful article about a year ago in the Public Interest quoting all of that evidence. Yeah, I don't believe everything should be subjected to the free market. I don't think people should be subjected to the free market. I don't believe that people should be bought and sold. I don't think babies should be bought and sold. I don't think pornography and obscenity should be bought and sold. I think society has a right to step in at some point, in some way, and say, no, the free markets are good for commodities, but we're not talking here about commodities. We are talking here about human values, and this is not permissible. I'm older than you, Marty. You know, the America I knew when I grew up was very much like that. We had rather mild, highly decentralized censorship. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York City, probably the best mayor we had in this century, at one point decided that the Minsky burlesque shows we had in the city were bad for young people. I don't know if they really were or not. But he decided to lower the quality of life in the city, and he closed them down, just like that. He was taken to court, and he won. In those days, the courts took a different view of what was called pornography or obscenity, or in a sense, we're talking about, what do they call those things in cafes? Never mind. But in any case, he did it, and
yes, but
that was done.
But it was easy in those days. What do you propose?
Why is it easier?
What do you propose against MTV?
Well, as a matter of fact, we have been discussing with people what things you might propose against MTV. Namely, you can put a technical gizmo in every television set that is sold.
And the parent can turn it off.
And the parent can turn it off good, I mean forever.
Yeah, but the parent is the problem, or a part of the problem.
Well, I don't know how to produce new parents, I'm sorry. Come on, I mean, the parent cares. You can give the parent instructions, say do this, and the kid will never see MTV again, not on your television set. He may go with the neighbors, but it's a problem for your neighbor. Look, you can't solve all these problems. We live in a hedonistic culture, and I don't much like it. And you cope with it as best you can. The courts make it very difficult, I must say.
We're going to end the evening with a statement by Professor Ruth Weiss.
Well, hardly a statement, but alas, the conference that began yesterday must end today, so I would like to bring it at least informally to a formal conclusion. It's been an absolute joy from start to finish working on this conference, and I realized from Irving Kristol why that has been the case. It's because it has had to do with neoconservatism. Also because it has had to do with working with Harvey Mansfield, who is visible, and also with Delba Winthrop, who has been mostly responsible for all the success of the conference. And I'd also like to thank our administrator, Heidi Sander, the administrator of the Center for Jewish Studies, for her work. I'm enormously grateful to the participants, most especially, if I may say so, to Norman Podhoretz and to Neil Kozadoy, the editors of Commentary, for letting us talk them into having this conference on the 50th anniversary of Commentary. And I should tell the participants that one of the most astute students I know here said to me after having attended today that this was the best day that he'd spent at Harvard. So I think this compliment goes to you. Clearly, when we planned this, as you must understand, it was a very different political picture. When we thought of the topic, what has neoconservatism wrought, our thinking was, I think, very modest. And in the meantime, last November, it seems that there was a turnabout in the political and political culture, which was much greater, I think, than anyone had claimed that neoconservatism could be credited with. So it seems that this conference takes place at a significant turning point in our political culture. And having gone this far, maybe I'd say that we should try it again next year and see if we can move a little further. In any case, thanks very much.
Michael, cheer up. You may get your chance again.